Have you ever thought about where your cell phone came from? Last year, the world purchased over a billion smartphones. They connect us, entertain us, organize our lives, and likely even delivered this lecture to you. But have you ever stopped to think about how it got to you and what it cost? The cobalt in your phone might have been dug by a child miner in the Congo. The processor was likely assembled under grueling conditions in a Chinese or Indian factory. Was probably shipped around global supply chains controlled by multinational corporations, regulated, often loosely, by a global system of trade, finance, and law. And yet, almost all the profits wound up in Seoul or Silicon Valley, not in Shenzhen, and certainly not in Kinshasa or Lubumbashi. For the most part, international relations considers diplomacy, war, and the power of states. But what if we're missing the bigger picture? Marxist theorists argue that to understand global politics, we have to follow the money through class struggle, exploitation, and the deep inequalities that are baked into the global capitalist system. For Marxists, the international system reflects the logic of capitalism. And unlike liberals who believe the global economy functions in a fundamentally neutral manner, Marxists believe the economy is structured to benefit what Marxists would call a transnational capitalist class. Corporate executives, financiers, and political elite, whose interests are shaped and advanced by powerful multinational corporations and the wealthy states that support them. Marxist theory begins with the idea that economic forces shape political and social life, an approach usually referred to as historical materialism. By this logic, the global system is fundamentally driven not by ideas, institutions, or states, but by the struggle between classes over control of resources. And as a result, Marxism offers a radically different interpretation of global politics, one that sees poverty and inequality not as problems to be solved within the system, but as necessary outcomes produced by the system itself. So how does Marxist thought help us make sense of the dynamics of global inequality? It starts by looking at the deep structures of society. One of the central concepts in Marx's framework is the mode of production, the way society is organized to produce goods and services. He divides this into two interrelated parts. The first is the economic base, which Marx views as the foundation of society. The base itself is made of two components: the means of production, which include the tools, technologies, raw materials, and factories required to produce goods, and the relations of production, the social and power structures that govern it all. Who owns the factories? Who controls the resources? Who works for whom? These relations define the economic system, whether it's slavery, feudalism, or capitalism. Built on top of this economic base is what Marx calls the superstructure. This includes all other aspects of society: laws, politics, culture, religion, education, and art. According to Marx, the superstructure grows out of the base and serves to legitimize and maintain it. For example, a capitalist society's legal system, the part of the superstructure, is built around protecting private property and enforcing contracts, ideas that are essential for the economic base to function. From a classical Marxist perspective, the state isn't a neutral referee standing above economic interests. Instead, it's part of the superstructure, an institution designed to protect and reproduce the economic base. In capitalist societies, this means that the state acts to defend the interests of capital by enforcing property rights, suppressing labor unrest, managing economic crises, and expanding access to markets. In this view, the state is not above class struggle. It's a key instrument through which class power is exercised and maintained. This model is powerful, but it's also the source of a major critique we'll return to, that of economic determinism, the idea that economics determines everything else. But for now, let's use this framework to understand capitalism. Under a capitalist mode of production, the key relationship is between the bourgeoisie, the capitalists who own the means of production, and the proletariat, the workers who must sell their labor to survive. Crucially, Marx did not believe that the conflict and exploitation between these two classes stemmed from individual morality. Capitalists don't exploit workers because they're personally greedy. They do it because the system compels them to. To survive in a competitive market, a company must maximize profits, cut costs, and expand its market share. Any capitalist who refuses to play by these rules, perhaps by dramatically raising wages out of sheer goodwill, would be outcompeted and driven out of business. The logic of the system forces their hand. This internal logic, the relentless need to innovate, cut costs, and find new markets, is precisely what pushes capitalism beyond national borders. For Marxists, this isn't just international trade, it's the geographic expression of capitalism's core dynamic. The engine of expansion is what drives historical forces of imperialism and the modern process of globalization, as corporations scour the globe for cheaper labor, new resources, and untapped consumers. What makes capitalism so distinct from earlier systems was the way it made everyone dependent on the market for their survival. Under feudalism, a peasant's life was tied to their lord through tradition and mutual, if deeply unequal, obligation. Under capitalism, these social ties are severed. If you don't work, you don't get paid, and if you don't get paid, you don't eat. The market becomes the ultimate arbiter of life. Finally, Marx argued that crises aren't bugs in the system, they're features hardwired into its logic. Crises of overproduction, making too much stuff for people to buy, or of underconsumption, not paying workers enough to buy the stuff they make, and falling rates of profit are intrinsic to the rhythm of capitalism, often leading to economic instability that can only be resolved through state intervention or further global expansion. It's also important to remember that Marxism wasn't designed just to interpret the world, it was meant to change it. For Marx, theory and practice, or what he calls praxis, are inseparable. Understanding capitalism's logic was the first step towards organizing collectively to overcome it. In that sense, Marxism is not only an analytical tool, it's also a revolutionary framework aimed at systemic transformation. Now that we've outlined the basic tenets of Marxist thought, it's important to also step back and ask, where does this framework fall short? What are its blind spots or limitations, especially when we apply it to international relations? First, and perhaps most often cited, is the critique of economic determinism. As we've just discussed, Marx places the economy at the center of everything. For him, politics, culture, even ideas about morality or nationalism, all of these are shaped by the material organization of production. But critics argue that this explanation can be overly reductive. It doesn't leave much room for agency, for people to act in unpredictable ways, or for non-economic factors like identity, religion, or ideology to drive political change. Can change come from above through politics or culture? Can ideas reshape the system? Critics, especially contemporary critical theorists, argue yes, and that Marx's original model, while powerful, needs to be expanded to account for these dynamics. Second, classical Marxism doesn't really give us a well-developed theory of the state or of international relations. Marx focused overwhelmingly on class conflict within societies and assumed that capitalism's internal contradictions would eventually lead to revolution. But he didn't say much about how states behave internationally. Why do states pursue war or form alliances? What role do borders, sovereignty, or nationalism play? While later Marxist thinkers like Lenin, Gramsci, Amin, Wallerstein, and others would try to fill this gap, classical Marxism largely left these questions unanswered, and the state was often reduced to serving as a mere instrument of the ruling class, oversimplifying how complex state behavior actually is. A third critique concerns Marx's predictions about capitalism's future. Marx believed that capitalism would intensify inequality to such a degree that it would eventually collapse under its own contradictions and give rise to socialism. But so far at least, that hasn't happened. Capitalism has certainly evolved. It's become more global, more financialized, and more unequal in some ways, but it certainly hasn't collapsed. Instead, it's proven remarkably adaptable. Now, to be fair, Marx couldn't have predicted the rise of 20th century welfare states like the New Deal in the US or social democracy in post-war Europe, which helped to blunt class conflict through redistributive policies, labor protections, and public services. Nor could he have anticipated the ways in which globalization would allow capital to escape strong domestic social and labor movements by moving production overseas. Critics argue that his theory underestimated capitalism's ability to use the state and global expansion to manage its crises and to co-opt resistance. A fourth critique, especially relevant today, is the charge of Eurocentrism. Marx's analysis was based on the development of capitalism in 19th century Europe. Critics argue that in making class the central axis of conflict, his framework often sidelines other fundamental drivers of exploitation, especially race and gender. Postcolonial and feminist scholars, who we'll explore soon, ask pressing questions. How did colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade shape global capitalism? How does the system rely on the often unpaid labor of women? By universalizing the class struggle, classical Marxism can sometimes obscure the specific ways that imperialism and patriarchy have often been entangled in the global economy. So, where does that leave us? Classical Marxism may not give us all the tools we need to understand international relations today. It under-theorizes the state, downplays culture and identity, and offers a fairly rigid vision of historical change. But what it does give us is a powerful lens for understanding inequality. So the next time you pick up your phone, Marxism challenges you to look past the logo and the sleek design. It asks you to see the device not just as a product, but as a node in a vast network of class relations, global labor, and uneven development. It forces us to ask not just how the world works, but for whom.